She weighed 200 pounds, owned nothing but a second-hand dress and a pair of worn-out boots, and the entire town of Red Hollow laughed when she walked up to the most powerful rancher in 3 territories and handed him a scarf she'd knitted herself. They laughed harder when Cole Barrett didn't throw it back, and they stopped laughing entirely the day she saved everything he had. This is not a story about a man who fell in love. This is a story about a town that was wrong about everything. The drought, the land, the water, and most of all, about Lena Hart. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. You won't regret it. The trouble with Cole Barrett was that he was too much of everything. Too much land. 4,000 acres of grassland running north from the Sulphur Creek Basin all the way up to the Pine Ridge where the elk came down in October. Too much cattle. Nearly 1,800 head when the season was good, which it had been for 3 straight years. Too much reputation. Built not just on inheritance, but on the kind of stubborn, grinding work that made older ranchers respect him even when they didn't like him. His father had left him the bones of the operation. Cole had put the meat on it himself, 12-hour days and split knuckles in winters that cracked the skin right off a man's hands. He was 34 years old, 6'1", with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that women found compelling and men found difficult to argue with. He didn't drink except on the nights when the books came out badly. He didn't gamble except on cattle futures, which some men said amounted to the same thing. He kept his word when he gave it, and he gave it slowly. That combination, land, reputation, and the particular quality of a man who does not need to impress anyone, made Cole Barrett the most pursued bachelor between the Cimarron foothills and the territorial capital. The women who wanted him were not subtle about it. Margaret Hollis was the first serious contender in the eyes of Red Hollow's social architecture. She was 41, twice widowed, and had come out of her second husband's death with a cattle operation of her own, smaller than Cole's but solvent, and sitting on water rights that any rancher in the territory would have traded a finger for. She wore good wool, kept her hair pinned with real silver, and had a habit of showing up wherever Cole happened to be conducting business. Appearing with perfect timing at the grain exchange or the farrier's yard or the weekly stock meeting at Alderman's Hall, as if she'd simply been passing by. She wasn't simply passing by. Everyone knew it. Cole knew it. Margaret knew that Cole knew it, and she didn't much care. She was practical about these things. Then there was Vera Dunmore, who was 28 and the daughter of Owen Dunmore, who owned the largest dry goods operation in Red Hollow and had his fingers in the freight contracts that supplied half the ranches in the county. Vera was pretty in the way that careful grooming and good nutrition produces in a young woman who has never gone without anything. She had opinions about curtains and china patterns, and had once mentioned, loud enough for the right people to hear, that Barrett Ranch would benefit significantly from a woman's organizational touch. There were others, widows and daughters, and a school teacher from Laramie who had come to visit her cousin and stayed 2 seasons longer than she'd planned. The town watched all of them with the attentive interest that frontier communities reserve for romantic competition, which is to say, the interest of people who don't have much else to entertain them through the long, flat stretches of an ordinary week. Cole treated all of them with a consistent, maddeningly polite distance. He would tip his hat to Margaret Hollis and answer her questions about cattle prices with genuine information, nothing more. He would nod at Vera Dunmore in the dry goods store when her father was present and say, yes, it looked like rain, and then he would buy his nails and his rope and go. He was not cold. He was not rude. He was just unreachable in some way that the women of Red Hollow couldn't quite identify, and that quality made them want to reach him more. His foreman, a sun-dried 50-year-old named Dix Pardee, who had worked the Barrett land since Cole's father's time, summarized the situation one October morning while they were mending fence line in the north pasture. Margaret Hollis was at Alderman's again last night, Dick said, not looking up from the wire. Sat 2 seats down from where you were going to sit. Coincidence, I'm sure. Vera Dunmore sent her father over to talk freight rates with you. You noticed that? I noticed. Man, 3 ranchers in this county would arm wrestle each other into the dirt for the chance at either one of those women. Dix pulled the wire taut and held it. What's wrong with you? Cole handed him the clip and said, Nothing's wrong with me. Something's off. I just don't want what they're offering. Dick straightened up and looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has watched someone he respects say something he considers deeply foolish. What are they offering that you don't want? Cole thought about it for a moment. The wind came across the pasture from the north, carrying the first real edge of cold that meant winter was leaning in. A transaction, he said finally. Hollis wants my water basin. Dunmore wants my name on her daughter. The school teacher from Laramie. He paused. I don't know what she wants, but she looks at this land like she's pricing it. Most marriages are transactions, Dick said. That's not a new feature. I know. You're going to die alone with your cattle, is what I'm saying. Probably, Cole agreed, and went back to the fence. It was the second week of November when he first noticed Lena Hart, and he almost didn't. She was coming out of Alderman's Hall on a Thursday afternoon, moving against the current of the small crowd filing in for the weekly traders' meeting, and she was carrying something wrapped in brown cloth under one arm. She was, big was the word most people used, though they usually found crueler words when she wasn't in earshot. Heavy in the hips and shoulders, round-faced, with dark hair that she kept pinned back in a way that was practical rather than decorative. Her dress was clean but had been let out at the seams probably more than once, and her boots were the kind that had been resoled rather than replaced. Cole noticed her because she walked directly into Hector Dunmore, Vera's father, who was coming the other direction with two other merchants and not looking where he was going. She bounced off him and dropped the cloth bundle, and it came unwrapped on the wooden sidewalk, and what fell out was a scarf. Long, handmade dark blue wool with a pattern worked into it that must have taken real time. Hector Dunmore looked down at it, then up at her and said, "Watch where you're going, girl," in a tone that suggested the sidewalk was his by right. "I'm sorry," Lena said. She crouched down to gather the scarf. Her face was flushed. "I'm sorry, Mr. Dunmore." He'd already moved on, his companions with him. None of them looked back. She sat there for a moment on the sidewalk, not quite sitting, crouching, her hands on the scarf. And Cole saw her close her eyes briefly, the way a person does when they are working to keep something interior from showing on the outside. Then she got up, tucked the scarf back under her arm, and walked on. He didn't think much more about it that day. He learned about her in pieces, the way you learn about anyone in a small town, through overheard conversations and the gap-filling that happens naturally when people talk. The Hart homestead had been a quarter section out on the eastern edge of the county, dry land that Lena's father had worked for 15 years without quite breaking even. 2 years ago, her father had died of a fever that took him in 4 days, the kind of fast-moving death that leaves a family no time to prepare. Her mother had lasted another 8 months before her heart went. There was a brother, but he'd gone north to the mining camps and sent money twice and then stopped. No one in Red Hollow had heard from him in over a year. The homestead was gone. Lena had sold it to cover the debts. Or rather, the bank had taken it, and she'd received what was left after, which wasn't much. She was living in a single room above Alderman's Hall, working in the kitchen of the Red Hollow boarding house for room credit and a small wage, and taking in mending work in the evenings. She was 22 years old. This information reached Cole gradually and without any particular drama. It was just the texture of a small town, the way certain people's circumstances became common knowledge without anyone making an announcement. He filed it away without attaching much to it. Until the morning she showed up at Barrett Ranch. It was a Tuesday in late November, a week before the first real snow was expected. Cole was in the yard working with a 2-year-old gelding that had a bad habit of shying at sudden sound, trying to patience train it past that nervous instinct, when he heard the gate. He looked up, and there was Lena Hart standing at the edge of the yard with her hands clasped in front of her and the dark blue scarf over her arm. He handed the lead rope to the stable hand and walked over. "Miss Hart." She looked surprised that he knew her name, which he registered. "Mr. Barrett." She swallowed. "I know you don't know me. I know this is irregular." She paused, and he could see she had rehearsed something and was now deciding whether to say it the way she'd rehearsed it or not. She went for the other version. I'm not here for anything except to give you this." She held out the scarf. He looked at it. He looked at her. "Why?" he said. "Last spring," she said, "when the Alderman barn went up. My family's barn, I mean. I didn't have a barn anymore, but I was renting space in Alderman's East Storage when it caught. You were one of the men who helped put it out. I lost some things, but not everything, and I know you don't. I know it wasn't on my account that you did it. But I had some wool from before, and I thought—" She stopped. "I made it for you. It took a while." He took the scarf from her. It was heavier than it looked, properly made, the wool tight and even, and the pattern, he turned it over, was a pine bough design, simple but precise. Someone had put real hours into this. "This is good work," he said. "Thank you. You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to." He looked up from the scarf to her face, and she met his eyes for a moment before looking away at the gelding in the yard, which was standing perfectly still for once, watching them both with its ears pricked forward. "You want to come inside?" Cole said. "It's cold." "No," she said quickly. "No, I should get back. I wanted you to have it." She turned to go. He watched her walk back to the gate, and he noticed that her coat was too thin for the weather, buttoned all the way up with the collar turned, but still thin. He noticed the resoled boots again. He noticed the way she moved. Not hurriedly, not self-consciously, just walking, like a person who didn't have any particular illusions about what kind of figure she cut in the world. He stood in the yard with the scarf in his hands for a long time after she left. Dix came up beside him eventually, looked at the scarf, looked at Cole's face. "That the Hart girl?" Dix said. "Yeah." "What'd she want?" "To give me this." Dix examined it. "Nice work." "Yeah." A pause. The gelding blew air through its nose and pawed the ground once. "Don't," Dix said. "Don't what?" "I know that look." "You don't know anything," Cole said, but not unkindly, and he folded the scarf carefully and went inside. He started noticing her after that, the way you notice something once you've paid attention to it once. Suddenly, it's everywhere you look. He saw her at the boarding house when he went to pay a freight bill with the alderman office. She was carrying a load of folded linens down the back stairs, her arms full, moving at the efficient pace of someone who has a lot of work and a fixed amount of time. She didn't see him. He saw her at the dry goods store on a Saturday, standing at the counter with a very small list and making decisions that took longer than they should have, which meant she was doing arithmetic in her head about what she could actually afford. She bought thread and a single yard of cotton batting and a paper of needles. She put back a small tin of dried apple slices after holding it for a moment. He saw her at the stock meeting at Alderman's Hall, which surprised him because she had no obvious reason to be at a stock meeting. But she was there, sitting in the back row with a composition book on her knee, writing things down. When he glanced her way, she was watching the man at the front talk about spring cattle prices with an expression of genuine concentration, like someone learning a language they intended to actually use. He asked Dix about it later. The Hart girl was at the stock meeting. Dix looked up from the feed ledger. Was she? What's she doing at a stock meeting? Heard she's been going to those for a couple months. Dix went back to the ledger. Also been to the county water board sessions and the land office public hearings. Why? Don't know. She keeps notes. Cole thought about that. A 22-year-old woman with no land and no cattle going to water board sessions and keeping notes in a composition book. He couldn't quite account for it. She working somewhere besides the boarding house? No. Dix turned a page. Well, she does some piecework accounting for 2 or 3 of the small outfits that can't afford a real bookkeeper. Half wages, from what I hear. She's trying to put together enough to lease something, maybe. Lease what? A field. 40 acres out near Sulphur Creek that the Haverford widow isn't using. Dix closed the ledger. She wants to run 20 head of sheep. Cole said nothing. 20 head of sheep on 40 acres in this county, Dix continued with the tone of a man offering a fair assessment, is either a reasonable start or a way to lose everything you've saved in one bad winter. Depends on the sheep. Depends on a lot of things. Cole picked up his hat. She say where she's getting the money? Not to anyone I talked to. He thought about the tin of dried apple slices she'd put back, the arithmetic behind her eyes, the scarf that had taken her weeks to knit from wool she'd saved from before her parents died, given to a man she'd never properly spoken to because he'd helped fight a fire that wasn't even her fire. He had a feeling she was the most careful person he'd met in a long time. The social architecture of Red Hollow registered Cole Barrett's interest in Lena Hart approximately 3 weeks before Cole himself would have admitted he had any. It started with small signals that the town read fluently, the currency of attention in a place where everyone watches everyone else because there's no alternative. He'd stopped to speak to her outside the grain exchange one afternoon, nothing remarkable in the words themselves, just asking about the Haverford lease, whether she'd made progress. But he'd stood there for 15 minutes, and people saw. He'd passed her on the street 2 days later and touched the brim of his hat, and she'd nodded back. And there was something in both gestures that was different from how you'd greet an acquaintance. The temperature between them, if such a thing can be observed from across a muddy street in a small frontier town, was different. The women who had been maneuvering for Cole's attention registered this shift the way livestock register a change in weather. Before they could articulate exactly what had changed, just with a prickling awareness that something had. Margaret Hollis brought it up at the ladies' sewing circle, tactfully, which in this case meant framing it as concern. "I hear Cole Barrett has been speaking with the Hart girl," she said, not looking up from her needlework. "I heard that too," said Greta Alderman, who was 70 and had no stake in the proceedings but an inexhaustible appetite for them. "She has nothing," Margaret said. "No land, no family connections. She does mending." A pause. "She's not exactly—" She stopped herself before finishing that sentence the way she'd intended to. "Pretty?" Greta suggested. "I was going to say she's not exactly what one would expect a man of Cole's position to be interested in." "Men are frequently interested in things that don't match their position," Greta said serenely. "That's been going on since the beginning." "He can't be serious," Vera Dunmore said. She was there for the sewing circle but rarely sewed anything, which everyone had noted but no one mentioned. "He's probably just... he feels sorry for her. She's had a hard time of it." "Maybe," said Greta. "Cole Barrett doesn't do things out of pity," said another woman quietly. Her name was Ruth Kinney, and she was 55, and had been married to the same man for 30 years, and had no stake in this personally, but she said it like someone stating a fact they'd observed carefully. "He's too practical for pity. If he's paying attention to that girl, it's because he sees something in her." That sentence sat in the room for a moment. Margaret Hollis finished a stitch with more force than necessary and said nothing further. Cole was alone in his study on a Friday evening in early December, going over the winter supply ledgers, when Dix knocked on the door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was his privilege as a man who had worked for the Barrett family for 22 years. "The Dunmore family," Dix said, "is having a dinner. Tomorrow night. You're invited, specifically." He held out an envelope. Vera hand-delivered it. Cole looked at the envelope without taking it. "What kind of dinner?" "The kind where you're the only unmarried man invited, and there are 11 people attending, and Vera is in charge of the seating arrangement." "No." "Cole?" "No." Dix put the envelope on the desk. "You understand that Owen Dunmore's freight contracts supply about a third of this operation. The man can make that difficult." "He can try." Dix sat down in the chair across the desk that nobody was supposed to sit in without being invited. He sat in it anyway. "What are you doing?" "Ledgers. With the Hart girl." "What are you doing?" Cole looked up from the ledger. "I don't know yet." "That's not—" Dix stopped. Reconsidered. "All right. But you understand what you're walking into." "I understand what people are going to say." "They're already saying it. The mending girl. The fat girl from nowhere with nothing." Dick said it plainly, because he thought it was better to say the thing plainly than let it exist only as a shape in the air between them. "They're going to say you've lost your mind." "Probably." "And?" Cole looked out the dark window at the yard where the snow was beginning to come down. The first real snow of the season, settling over the grass and the fence posts and the dark shapes of the horses in the paddock. "Her parents died." "Fine," he said. "She sold what was left to pay what they owed. She's living in one room above a public hall, and she's going to waterboard sessions and keeping notes in a composition book and saving money to lease 40 acres for 20 sheep." He paused. "And she spent weeks of her evenings making a scarf from the last wool she had, and walked 2 miles out to a ranch in November to give it to a man she'd never spoken to because she wanted him to know someone had noticed what he did." The fire in the hearth ticked once. Wind hit the window. "She's the most purposeful person in this town," Cole said. "Maybe the most purposeful person I've met, and everyone here is too busy laughing at her dress size to notice." Dix sat with that for a moment. You might be right, he said finally. I'm right. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Easy is not something I've been particularly attached to, Cole said, and went back to the ledger. He went to find her the next morning. Not to the boarding house. He didn't want to make things complicated for her at her work. But he knew from something Dix had mentioned that she walked to the county land office on Saturday mornings to look at the public records. He didn't know exactly why she did that either, but he intended to find out. She was on the steps of the land office when he rode up, coming out with her composition book open and a pencil still in her hand, reading something she'd written. She looked up when she heard the horse, and the expression that moved across her face was complicated. Recognition, wariness, and something she quickly suppressed that might have been pleasure. Mr. Barrett, he swung down. Miss Hart, what are you reading? She looked at the book, then at him. Land surveys, easements, water right allocations. She said it like she expected him to find it dull. Show me, he said. She blinked. I'm not being polite, he said. I'm interested. Show me what you're looking at. A pause. Then she turned the composition book around and held it out to him, and he stepped up onto the bottom stair to read what she'd written, which put him close enough that he could smell the cold air on her coat and see that the cover of the composition book was worn at the corners from regular use. She'd been tracking water right allocations across the county for the past 6 months. The entries were meticulous. Dates, parcel numbers, names of right holders, notes on transfers. She had cross-referenced several of them with the original survey maps and marked 3 or 4 cases where the recorded allocations didn't match the surveys. He looked at her. Where'd you learn to do this? He said. My father kept records, she said. Everything. He was careful that way. I grew up reading his ledgers. A small pause. I like knowing how things actually work. These discrepancies you've marked. Yes. You shown these to anyone? I tried, she said, with a flatness in her voice that told him exactly how that had gone. At the water board meeting in October, the chairman told me the records were fine and that I should. He suggested I direct any concerns to a man of property who could raise them officially. A man of property. He felt something tighten in his chest that wasn't quite anger, or it was anger but the controlled kind, the kind that doesn't spend itself immediately. These 3 right here, he said, pointing to the entries she'd marked. These are parcels north of Sulphur Creek. Yes, that's my basin drainage. She looked at him steadily. I know. The wind came down the street and lifted the loose edges of the composition book's pages. She put her thumb on them to hold them. Miss Hart, he said carefully, I think I'd like to hear everything you know about this. She studied his face for a moment, apparently checking whether he was serious or humoring her. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her. All right, she said. You're going to want to see the original survey maps. I've been requesting them from the land office. They keep losing the request. Come with me, he said. We'll unlose it. The land office clerk looked up with a particular expression when Cole Barrett walked in with Lena Hart beside him. Not the expression of a man who has seen something inappropriate, but the expression of a man filing information he expects to be relevant later. Cole paid it no mind. He asked for the survey maps. He used the tone of voice that made it clear no one would be losing any requests. Behind him, Lena Hart had her pencil ready. The winter pressed down on Red Hollow, in the weeks that followed with the particular weight of a season that intends to make itself felt. The creek froze in the last week of December. The snow came in layers, one on top of another, and the temperature dropped far enough that the old-timers shook their heads and said they hadn't seen it like this since the bad winter of '69. Cole and Lena met 3 times in that period, each time at the land office, each time with a stated purpose. The survey maps, a question about the water right transfers, a comparison of the allocation dates against the county commissioner's minutes. The meetings were practical. They sat across a table from each other with documents between them and talked about easements and parcel boundaries. Dix, when he heard about the 3rd meeting, looked at Cole with an expression of resigned amusement. Easements, he said. She's found something real, Cole said. I need to understand it. You could have any surveyor in the county look at it. She's already looked at it. She's the one who found it. Cole paused. She's better at this than any surveyor I've hired. That was true. He'd brought in a county surveyor named Hedges the previous spring for a boundary dispute with a neighbor. and Hedges had spent 3 days and charged him accordingly and come back with the approximate quality of analysis that Lena had done on her own in a composition book in her spare time between mending work. "I'm going to offer her work," Cole said. "What kind of work?" "Records work. The ranch ledgers are a mess. I've got 4 years of purchase orders that haven't been properly cross-referenced, and the cattle registry is 18 months behind." He looked at Dix. "She'd have it done in a month." Dix considered this. "You understand that everyone in town is going to say, 'I know what they're going to say. Do you care?'" Cole thought about the land office clerk's expression, the way the water board chairman had told her to direct her concerns to a man of property, the dried apple slices she'd put back on the shelf. "No," he said. "I don't." He made her the offer on a Thursday, at the end of their 4th meeting at the land office. She'd been there first, as she always was, with the composition book already open and 3 new entries marked with the particular precision that he'd come to recognize as her working rhythm. He waited until they'd finished the business of the morning before he said it. "I want to hire you for records work at the ranch," he said. "Quarterly wage. The same rate I'd pay a town bookkeeper, not a half rate." He paused. "And I'll co-sign the Haverford lease for the 40 acres so you can start with the sheep in spring." She looked at him. "Why?" she said. "Because you're the best person for the work." "Mr. Barrett." "Cole." She stopped. "My name is Cole," he said. "If we're going to work together, Miss Hart is going to get old fast." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the land office window, someone's horse went by in the snow, hooves muffled, the sound half swallowed by the weather. "People will say things," she said. "They already are. They'll say you feel sorry for me." "Do you feel like I feel sorry for you?" She considered him the way she considered the survey maps, seriously, with the intention of reaching an accurate conclusion rather than a comfortable one. "No," she said. "Then we're fine," he said. Another pause. "Lena," she said, and something in the way she said her own name, as if offering it, made the air in the room feel different. "Lena," he agreed. She looked down at the composition book, then back up at him, and the wariness that had been in her eyes since the first time he'd ridden up to the land office was still there, but sitting alongside something else now, something quieter. "All right," she said. "When do I start?" "Month." She started the following Monday, arriving at Barrett Ranch at 7 in the morning with her composition book, a worn leather satchel that held her reference notes and pencils, and a practicality about the whole arrangement that Cole found. The word that kept coming to him was bracing. She was not deferential. She did not perform gratitude beyond a single direct thank you on the first morning. She assessed the state of the ranch records with the honest expression of someone surveying a mess they've agreed to clean up, said, "These are quite bad," and started. She worked in the small office off the main room, at a desk that Cole had cleared for her, and she worked with the concentrated quiet of someone who is genuinely interested in what she's doing rather than someone who is performing industry to justify their wages. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized 4 years of purchase orders into a system that Cole understood immediately when she explained it, which meant it was a good system. By the end of the second week, she found a billing error that had been costing the ranch money for 2 years. Not a large amount, but real. She put the documentation on Cole's desk with a note explaining it. Cole stared at the note for a while, then stared at the office door, then went and stood in the doorway and said, 2 years. Lena looked up. Yes? The freight rate was applied to a category that should have had a different rate. The original contract language is ambiguous, but she stopped. The difference over 2 years is approximately, I can see what it is. I've drafted a letter to the freight company if you want to. You drafted a letter. It's in the folder. You don't have to use it. He looked at the folder on the corner of her desk. He looked at her. Lena, he said. Yes? What are they paying you at the boarding house? A pause. She named a number. It was very small. He named a number that was considerably larger than what he'd offered her at the land office and said, That's your wage. She started to say something. Don't argue, he said. You found 2 years of billing errors in 2 weeks. It's a fair wage. She closed her mouth. She opened it again. All right, she said, and went back to the ledger. The month of January passed, and then February, and Red Hollow watched the development at Barrett Ranch with the absorbed interest of a town that has identified its most compelling ongoing narrative and intends to follow it through to the conclusion. What they saw was Cole Barrett eating his noon meal with the Hart girl in the ranch kitchen on the days she worked, which was 4 days a week. Cole Barrett riding out with her on a Saturday afternoon to look at the Haverford 40 acres where the sheep were going to go. Cole Barrett standing with her at the county commissioners' meeting in February and raising, in his own name, as a man of property, the discrepancies in the water right allocations that she had found in her composition book. The commissioner, a man named Harlow, had listened with the expression of a man who is hearing something he'd rather not hear and said the records were likely clerical errors and would be reviewed. Cole had said, "When?" Harlow had said, "In due course." Cole had said, "I'd like a date." In the end, Harlow committed to March 15th. Cole wrote it down in front of him. Afterward, walking back through the cold, Lena had said, "He's not going to look at them." "Probably not," Cole agreed. "Then what?" "Then we already know where they are," Cole said. "We've documented everything. If something happens with those water rights, we have the records." She was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "You're thinking ahead," she said. "I'm thinking like you think," he said. And she looked at him sideways, and the wind was cold, and neither of them said anything more about it. But something shifted that afternoon into something it hadn't quite been before. It was Margaret Hollis who finally said the thing out loud. She said it to Cole directly, which was either admirably brave or simply the approach of a woman who had decided that subtlety was no longer an efficient strategy. She appeared at Barrett Ranch on a morning in late February, not a workday for Lena, who was at the Haverford acreage meeting with the widow about the lease terms. And she sat in the front room with a cup of coffee and said, "Cole, I want to speak plainly with you about the Hart girl." "All right," Cole said. "What you're doing is going to damage you." She said it without malice, with the efficiency of a woman delivering an honest assessment. "I'm not speaking as someone with a personal interest. I'm speaking as someone who knows how this community works. She is not—" She stopped. Started again. "She has no standing here. She has no family, no land. People are saying you've lost your judgment." "Which people?" "The Dunmores, the Reedman family, 2 of your business partners at the grain exchange." Cole, Lena Hart is a very capable young woman, from what I can see. I'm sure she is, but capable is not the same as—" She searched for the word. "The kind of woman a man in your position—" "Margaret," he said, quietly and not unkindly, "I'm going to stop you there." She stopped. "You are a capable person and I respect you, that's true. But the assumption underneath what you're saying is that I'm building something here that needs to accommodate the opinions of the Dunmore family." He paused. "I'm not." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the hearth said something between them that words didn't quite reach. "You care for her," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Cole said. No hesitation, no qualification. Margaret set her coffee cup down. She straightened her good wool coat. She stood. "Well," she said with a composure that cost her something he could see clearly, "I hope you know what you're doing." "I'm working on it," he said honestly. She left. Cole sat in the empty front room and looked at his hands and thought about the scarf. Dark blue, pine bough pattern, folded on the shelf in his bedroom where he'd put it in November and not moved since. He knew what he was doing. He wasn't entirely sure it was going to be simple. But then again, easy was not something he'd ever been particularly attached to. Outside, the February wind pushed hard against the ranch house, and the cattle in the south pasture moved together against it, and the snow that had been building since December showed no signs at all of letting up. The spring came late to Red Hollow that year, and when it came wrong. Too warm, too fast. Then cold again. The kind of erratic weather that made old ranchers chew their lips and watch the sky with their arms crossed. The creek unfroze and then half froze again. The grass came up pale and uncertain. The cattle that had made it through the winter looked thin in a way that wasn't going to correct itself quickly. And everyone in the county who had land and livestock was doing the arithmetic in their heads and not liking the numbers. Cole noticed the weather the way every rancher noticed it, as a constant low-grade concern running beneath whatever else was happening. But what was happening at Barrett Ranch in March was also this. Lena Hart had found the rest of it. She came to him on a Tuesday morning with the composition book and 3 additional pages she'd pulled from the county records. smoothed flat on the desk between them, and said, "The discrepancies aren't clerical errors." He looked at the pages. She'd mapped the water right transfers chronologically, and when you laid them out that way, the pattern was obvious. Not a mistake, a sequence. Rights that had originally belonged to small homesteaders and marginal landowners had moved, over a period of 4 years, through a series of intermediary names that meant nothing individually, into the effective control of 2 men, a land speculator named Hargrove, who operated out of the territorial capital, and a local businessman named Cass Pullman, who ran the Red Hollow Freight Depot and sat on the county water board. "Pullman," Cole said. "Yes." "He's on the water board. He's been on the board for 6 years," Lena said. "Long enough to understand how the allocation system works and where the weak points are." She pointed to a transfer from 2 years ago. "This one here. This is a right that originally covered the north tributary feeding into your basin. It transferred twice in 8 months. It's currently held by a company called Meridian Land and Cattle. I can't find any record of Meridian running cattle anywhere." Cole sat back in his chair. The ranch sounds came through the window. A horse in the yard, one of the hands calling to another across the fence line. Ordinary Tuesday morning at Barrett Ranch. "They're positioning," he said. "Yes, if there's a dry year, they control the water. They control enough of it to make things very difficult for the large operations along the Sulphur Creek drainage." She paused. "Which is you, primarily. And the Alderman spread. And the Reedman family. Reedman's already half sold." "I know." Her voice was careful, the way it got when she was working toward something she wasn't sure he would want to hear. "Cole, if Meridian, if Hargrove and Pullman, if they have what I think they have, and there's a drought, they don't even need to do anything dramatic. They just wait. And then they make an offer on the land when the ranchers can't sustain their herds without reliable water." He looked at her across the desk. "How long have you known this?" he said. "I suspected it in January. I needed the additional records to be sure." She met his eyes. "I'm sure now." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have told me when you suspected it. I didn't want to tell you something I wasn't certain of." "Lena, I know," she said, and it wasn't defensive, just acknowledging. "You're right. I should have." He stood up and went to the window and looked at the yard and the fields beyond it, and the pale spring grass that was trying to come in right. 4,000 acres, 1,800 head of cattle that were already thin from the winter, a water basin that fed everything on the northern range. "Harlow," he said, "the commissioner." "He committed to reviewing the records by March 15th, Lena said. "It's March 22nd. "Yes." He turned. "I need to talk to Dix. There's something else." He stopped. She looked at the composition book, then at him, and he saw the thing in her face she was working to keep neutral, which meant it wasn't neutral. "What?" he said. "Pullman knows I've been pulling the records. The land office clerk, Tipton. He told someone. I don't know who told Pullman, but 2 days ago, a man I don't know came to the boarding house and told Mrs. Alderman that I'd been spreading false information about county water rights, and that it was going to cause problems for people who depended on the freight depot." She said it evenly, but there was something underneath the evenness that was not quite steady. "Mrs. Alderman told me I should think carefully about what I was involving myself in. Cole felt the thing in his chest that was anger, but the cold, controlled kind. "Did she ask you to stop?" "She didn't use that word. She said she hoped things wouldn't become uncomfortable for anyone." He crossed the room in 3 steps and picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "Where are you going?" Lena said. "To have a conversation with Pullman." "Cole, not an argument, a conversation." He stopped at the door. "You're not going to lose your room at the boarding house over this. I'll make that clear." "That's not—" She stopped, and he could see she was deciding whether to say the next thing. She said it. "That's not what I'm worried about." He looked at her. "I'm worried that this is going to cost you something significant," she said, "and that I'm the reason it's becoming a problem now instead of later, when you'd have been better positioned to deal with it." The honesty of that, the specific shape of her concern, which was for him rather than for herself, sat in the room between them. "It was already a problem," he said. "You just found it before it found me." She didn't look entirely convinced. "Lena." He said her name the way he'd learned to say it over the past months, which was directly, without softening. You keeping notes in that composition book might be the thing that saves this ranch. You understand that. A pause. She looked at the pages on the desk. Go talk to Pullman, she said. Bulk it. Cass Pullman was a thick-necked man in his late 40s who had built his freight operation through a combination of genuine hard work and a talent for positioning himself in the path of other people's necessities. He had a quality that some men called practical and others called opportunistic, which, in his case, was both. He received Cole Barrett in the back office of the freight depot with the careful pleasantness of a man who knows a difficult conversation is coming and has decided to control the temperature of it. Cole, he said, what can I do for you? You sent someone to the boarding house, Cole said, to speak to Mrs. Alderman about Lena Hart. Pullman's expression didn't change much. That was a tell in itself. A man with nothing to hide would have shown more surprise. I heard she's been pulling county records and making some claims about water allocations. I was concerned she might be creating unnecessary confusion for people. What people? The board. The commissioner's office. Records get misread, especially by someone without a background in... The records aren't misread, Cole said. I've looked at them myself. Lena Hart's analysis is accurate. Meridian Land and Cattle holds water rights that were transferred from small homesteaders through a sequence of intermediaries over 4 years, and you've been on the board the entire time. Pullman was quiet for a moment. The freight depot made its sounds around them, the creak of the building, voices outside in the yard. Cole, Pullman said, and his voice shifted into something more careful. You have been a good neighbor to this operation for a long time. The freight contracts on your ranch alone are going to be reviewed, Cole said. Now, I'm not here to threaten you, Cass. I'm here to tell you to stay away from Lena Hart. Whatever concern you have about the water board records, you bring it to me directly. You don't send men to her workplace. He let that settle. Are we clear on that? It wasn't a question. Pullman's jaw worked slightly. We're clear, he said. Cole put his hat back on and left. He did not tell Lena exactly how that conversation had gone. He told her that Pullman understood the situation, which was true in a compressed way. What he did not tell her was that Pullman's expression as Cole walked out had been the expression of a man who has been temporarily checked but not stopped, and that Cole had recognized it because he'd seen that particular look before on men who had decided that patience was a better strategy than confrontation. What he told Dix that same evening was everything. Dix listened without interrupting, which was not typical of him. When Cole finished, Dix was quiet for a long moment. Hargrove's been in this territory before, Dix said finally. Not under that name. There was a land scheme over in Cattail County in '81, bought up water rights during a dry summer and then sold them back to the ranchers at 3 times the price, or took the land outright when they couldn't pay. Ruined 4 families. I know, Cole said. I heard about it at the time. And now he's here. Now he's here. And he's got Pullman on the inside of the water board and a drought that may or may not be coming. Cole looked at the fire. If it comes, when? Dick said. Cole nodded. When it comes, they'll have the position they need. They'll control the tributary water into the Sulphur Creek Basin and they'll wait for the herds to suffer and then they'll... He stopped. Make offers, Dick said. Low ones. Dix leaned back in his chair. So what do? We document everything we have, Lena's records, the survey maps, the transfer history. We make copies and we put them somewhere that isn't on this property. And then? And then we find the mountain channel. Dix stared at him. The old survey maps, the ones from the 1860s that predate the current allocation system, they show a water channel running from the northern ridge down through the pine country and joining the Sulphur Creek watershed above the main basin. Cole looked at him. If that channel can be reopened, the Barrett water supply is independent of the rights Hargrove's been buying up. Cole, that channel's been closed off. Yeah, rockslide in '74 blocked it. Maybe deliberately, maybe not. He paused. Lena found the original survey. She's been looking at it. Of course she had. Dix's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile. She find anything else in those surveys we should know about? He said. Probably, Cole said. I expect she'll tell us when she's sure. But the public part of it, The part that Red Hollow could observe and form opinions about happened on a Saturday in early April when Cole Barrett walked into the spring social at Alderman's Hall with Lana Hart beside him. It was not a formal occasion exactly. The spring social was a Red Hollow tradition that existed somewhere between a community meeting and a party. Ranchers and merchants and their families, some music, food contributed by various households. The particular loosening of formality that happened when winter finally released its grip enough that people wanted to be around each other again. Everyone came. It was the kind of event where you saw everyone you'd avoided seeing all winter, which was sometimes welcome and sometimes not. Cole had not been to the spring social in 3 years. He hadn't seen the point. This year he went because he had decided, with the deliberate quality that characterized most of his decisions, that continuing to operate in the gray zone of ambiguity was costing Lena more than it was protecting either of them. The town was going to talk regardless. He would rather give them something accurate to talk about. Lena, when he'd suggested it, had been quiet for long enough that he'd said, "You don't have to." "I know," she'd said. "I'm thinking." "What about?" "My dress," she said, with a flatness that made him think she was aware of how it sounded and didn't particularly care. "I have one that's decent. It's not—" She stopped. "People are going to look." "People look at everything in this town," he said. "That doesn't change based on what we do or don't do." She had looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to say a true thing or a diplomatic thing. "They're going to say you're embarrassing yourself," she said. "With me. Specifically. The way I look." He didn't say anything for a moment, because he understood that what she needed was not reassurance, which would have felt hollow, but acknowledgement. "Yes," he said. "Some of them will say that." She nodded, like someone receiving information they'd expected. "And?" she said. "And I don't particularly care what they say," he said, "but you're the one who has to decide how much you care. That's your choice, not mine." She had thought about it for another day. Then she'd said yes. About that. They arrived at Alderman's Hall on a Saturday evening, and the room registered their entrance the way rooms in small towns register things. A slight shift in the sound, conversations that didn't quite stop but changed pitch, a number of people who found reasons to look in the direction of the door. Lena wore a dark green dress that was clearly her best, and she had done her hair carefully, and she walked in with her shoulders level, in the particular way of someone who has decided to inhabit the situation fully rather than apologize for it. Cole was beside her, close enough to be clear about what this was without making a performance of it. Margaret Hollis was there. She saw them, and her expression moved through several things quickly, and she settled on a dignity that was genuine even if it cost her something. She nodded to Cole. She nodded after a brief pause to Lena. Vera Dunmore was there with her father. Owen Dunmore had the expression of a man who has invested in something and is watching the value decline. Vera looked at Lena with an assessment that was not entirely unkind. There was something in it that was almost curiosity, son, before she looked away. The man who caused the actual problem was a rancher named Burl Reedman, who had too much whiskey in him and enough resentment in general that the whiskey had nowhere good to go. Reedman had been in financial difficulty for 2 seasons, and he had the particular anger of a man who has made bad decisions and needs to locate the source of his trouble somewhere external. He was standing near the back of the hall with 2 other men when Cole and Lena moved past, and he said it loud enough to be heard. "There he is, Cole Barrett, brought his charity project." The sound in the room changed again. Cole stopped. He turned around slowly, and Lena, he felt it more than saw it, went very still beside him. Reedman's 2 companions had the expressions of men who have suddenly realized they are in a situation they would rather not be in. "Burl," Cole said quietly, "that's enough. Just saying what everyone's thinking." Reedman's chin came up. "You've got your pick of any woman in 3 counties and you're dragging around a—" "Stop there," Cole said. Still quiet. That was the thing about Cole Barrett's anger that people sometimes forgot. It didn't get louder as it got more serious. It got quieter. Reedman read something in his face and stopped. "You're going to want to think carefully about the next thing you say," Cole said, "because I've been doing business with your operation for 6 years, and I can stop doing that in about 4 words. He paused. "And those aren't the 4 words you're about to say." The room was very quiet. Riedman's jaw worked. He looked at Lena, then back at Cole, and whatever he found in Cole's expression settled it. He turned back to his drink and said nothing more. Cole turned back to Lena. Her face was composed in the careful way of someone using composure as a functional tool. He offered her his arm, not dramatically, just as a thing he was doing, and after a fraction of a second she took it. They moved further into the room. Later, near the end of the evening, when they were standing at the edge of things and the music had started and people were dancing or watching, Lena said, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "He's going to be—" "Riedman's already got problems that have nothing to do with me or you," Cole said. "His trouble is his own." She was quiet for a moment. "People are going to say you threatened him." "I stated a business consequence clearly. That's different from a threat." She looked at him sideways. "Is it?" "Yes." A beat. Mostly. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and in the yellow lamplight of Alderman's Hall with the fiddle playing, and everyone in Red Hollow watching without quite watching, something settled between them into a shape that both of them recognized, and neither of them named aloud. Not yet. The weeks that followed were the uneasy ones. Business partners did call. 2 men from the grain exchange came to Barrett Ranch together, which meant they'd coordinated, which meant it was formal. They sat in Cole's front room and made their case with the careful language of men who have decided to frame self-interest as concern. They talked about reputation, about the importance of strong alliances in uncertain times, about the coming season and the question marks around water and grazing rights. Cole listened to all of it. He thanked them for coming. He showed them out. Owen Dunmore pulled 2 freight contracts. Cole had expected one. 2 was a signal of how seriously Dunmore had taken the spring social, which told him more about Dunmore's investment in the situation than he'd previously measured. He found alternate freight arrangements within a week at slightly worse terms, which was the cost of the thing. Dix noted the cost without comment. Cole noted that Dix didn't tell him he'd been wrong. The real pressure came from somewhere he hadn't anticipated, which was from Lena herself. Not pressure to stop, but something more complicated. She came to him on a morning in late April, and she sat down across his desk and said, "I want to talk about what this is costing you." "We've talked about this." "Not specifically." "The Dunmore contracts. I found other arrangements. At worse terms. Temporarily." "Cole." She put her hands flat on the desk, which was a thing she did when she was being particularly direct. "I've been going through the ranch finances because that's my job. The ranch is sound. It's going to stay sound unless there's a drought, which there may be. But the margin that kept it sound through the last bad year was partly dependent on those freight rates." She paused. "I did that math. I wanted you to know I did it." "And what do you conclude from the math?" he said, because he knew her well enough by now to know that she didn't raise a problem without having moved some distance toward how she thought about it. "I conclude that the freight rate issue needs to be fixed by spring roundup," she said. "And I think I know how to fix it. But it involves approaching Harlan Marsh's operation about a cooperative freight arrangement, and Marsh isn't going to want to deal with Barrett Ranch as long as he thinks the water rights situation is unresolved, because Marsh's north fields are in the same drainage basin, and he's frightened." "You've thought about all of this." "It's my job." "Lena." He waited until she looked at him directly. "I know what you're doing. You're trying to build a case that you're worth what you're costing." She didn't deny it. "Stop," he said. "Not because you're wrong about the numbers, because that's not what this is about, and you know it." She was quiet for a long moment. "I know what people see when they look at me," she said, and her voice was even, the way it was when she was saying something she'd thought about for a long time. "They see someone who stumbled into something she doesn't deserve, and I need to—" She stopped. "Prove them wrong," he said. "Yes." "You've been proving them wrong since November," he said. "You've been proving them wrong since before I met you, when you were going to water board meetings with a composition book on your own time for reasons no one in this town thought to ask about." He looked at her steadily. "You don't owe this ranch anything, Lena. I hired you because you're the best person I've ever seen at this kind of work. Full stop. The rest of it—" He paused. "The rest of it is just what it is." She looked at her hands on the desk. "Talk to Marsh," Cole said. "If you think there's a freight solution there, talk to him. He might not take the meeting. Tell him it's about the water right allocation documentation, Cole said. He'll take the meeting. Something shifted in her face, the tight, careful composure that she maintained in the office most days, a composure he'd learned to distinguish from her actual ease, loosened slightly. All right, she said. And Lena? Yes. When the mountain channel is open and the water question is answered, he said, and it will be the people in this town who have been deciding what you're worth based on your dress and your family's debt, they're going to have to recalculate, and that's going to be worth watching. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read, and then she said simply, You believe that? Yes, he said. I do. Outside the ranch house window, the April sky was beginning to build clouds in the west. The kind that could be rain, could be nothing, could be the start of the long dry stretch that every rancher in the Sulphur Creek Basin was quietly dreading. The grass in the south pasture moved in the wind, pale green still, not the deep color it should have been by now. The season was turning. Everyone in Red Hollow could feel it, and none of them yet knew how bad it was going to get. The drought came the way bad things often do. Not all at once, but in degrees, each one small enough to explain away until the sum of them became undeniable. May was dry. June was drier. By the first week of July, the Sulphur Creek was running at half its normal volume, and the grass in the south pasture had gone from pale green to the color of old straw. Cole moved the herd north where the grazing was marginally better, which bought time but not much. The cattle were drinking more than the creek could comfortably sustain, and everyone along the drainage basin could feel the arithmetic of it tipping in the wrong direction. Red Hollow's social temperature changed with the weather. Drought had a way of concentrating people's anxieties into something that needed a target, and the target that was most available, the one the town had already been primed to resent, was Lena Hart. It started as the kind of talk that doesn't have a clear origin, the kind that seems to rise out of the ground of a community already under stress. She was a distraction, the talk went. Cole Barrett had been spending his energy and attention on a woman and her composition book and her 40 acres of sheep instead of managing his operation the way a man of his standing should have been managing it, and look at the result. The water situation, the freight contracts, the Dunmore business. All of it could be traced, if you were inclined to trace it, back to November when Cole had started paying attention to a girl who had no business being paid attention to. The logic was thin and the town knew it was thin, but thin logic moves fast when people are frightened, and Red Hollow was frightened. 3 small ranches along the creek had already sold, 2 of them to buyers no one in town could clearly identify. That the buyers might be Hargrove's Meridian operation was a thing that several people suspected and no one said out loud, because saying it out loud would have required acknowledging a problem more complicated than blaming the Hart girl. Lena heard the talk the way she heard most things, in pieces, through the gaps in conversations that went quiet when she walked into a room, through Mrs. Alderman's increasingly careful manner, through the way the women at the dry goods counter found reasons to finish their business quickly. She did not tell Cole about most of it. She kept the composition book, and she kept her notes, and she kept going to the land office. But she went earlier in the mornings now, before Tipton the clerk arrived, using the reading room hours that were technically open to the public, because it was easier than dealing with Tipton's particular brand of unease around her. What she found in the land office in the second week of July was the thing that changed everything, and she almost missed it. She had been pulling freight manifests, old ones going back to the late 1870s, cross-referencing them against the supply route records she'd been building since winter. Her original purpose had been to document the water right transfers, but the freight records had kept yielding adjacent information, the way good records always do when you read them carefully enough. She was looking for the supply routes that serviced the northern ridge, the area where the old mountain channel ran before the rockslide of '74, because Cole had asked her to build a case for the channel restoration that could withstand a county engineering review. What she found instead was a set of freight manifests from 1879 and 1880, filed under a contractor name she didn't recognize, covering supply deliveries to a location described only as Northern Ridge Improvement Works. The manifest quantities, dynamite primarily, along with survey equipment and what appeared to be specialized rock-moving apparatus, were significant. Not the quantities of a mining operation, and not the quantities of a road-building crew. The quantities of something more deliberate. She sat with the manifest for a long time, Then she pulled the county incident reports from 1874 and looked up the rock slide. The official record described it as a natural event, a winter freeze-thaw cycle that destabilized a section of the ridge and sent rock down across the channel bed. That was the record. But the freight manifests predated the rock slide by 8 months and listed the contractor's delivery address as within half a mile of the slide location. Her hand was not entirely steady when she closed the manifest folder. She went to Cole that afternoon, and she told him what she'd found, and she laid the documents out on his desk in the order that made the argument clearest. The manifests, the incident report, the survey map showing the channel location relative to the slide area. Cole looked at everything in silence for a long time. Dix was there, leaning against the wall, because Cole had called him in when Lena arrived with the look on her face that meant she'd found something serious. "The contractor," Cole said finally. "The name on the manifests." "Callaway Regional Works," Lena said. "I can't find any other county records for that company. No business registration, no other contracts, nothing." "Shell Company," Dick said. "Yes, that's what I think." She paused. "The dynamite quantities, I had Harlan Marsh's son look at them. He works demolition for the mine operation up north. He says the amounts are consistent with a controlled collapse of a rock formation. Not a large one, but targeted." Cole looked up from the manifests. "You talked to Marsh's son." "I needed someone who knew demolition. I didn't tell him what it was for. I described a hypothetical. Harlan Marsh himself. You talked to him about the freight cooperative arrangement last month." "Yes." "He agreed to the meeting." "He did. He was—" She paused. "He was more open to it than I expected. He's worried about the water situation, and he didn't like that I knew as much as I did about Meridian. I think it unsettled him productively." Dix made a sound that might have been approval. Cole looked at him. "If the slide was deliberate," Dix said, "and someone engineered it in 1874 to close off that channel, then the water rights scheme goes back further than we thought," Cole said. "This wasn't improvised. This was planned." The room was quiet. Hargrove would have been, what, in his early 30s in 1874, Cole said. "You said the Cattail County scheme was 1881. "This might have been the practice run," Lena said. Cole sat back. He looked at the ceiling the way he did when he was thinking through something from the structure out. "If we reopen the channel, if it's physically possible to reopen it, it doesn't just solve our water problem. It demonstrates that the closure was engineered. That's evidence of premeditation. That changes what we can do legally." "If we can get someone to look at it officially," Lena said. "The Territorial Land Commissioner, not the county. The county's compromised. The territorial office. They're in the capital." "Yes." He looked at her. "I need everything documented. Everything from November until now. The full chain." "I have it," she said. "I've had copies made. They're not on this property." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had trouble reading. It was somewhere between relief and something more personal. The expression of a man who has just understood that someone has been protecting him without telling him they were doing it. "Where are they?" he said. "The Marsh operation has a safe," she said. "Harlan owed me a favor after I found the billing error in his hay contracts. He's holding a copy." She paused. "And I sent a copy to a land law attorney in the capital. A woman named Devereaux. She wrote back. She's interested." Dix pushed off the wall. "She did all that," he said, to no one in particular. "When?" Cole said. "June, after Pullman's man came to the boarding house the second time." She said it flatly, watching his face. Cole went very still. "He came a second time." "Yes." "You didn't—" "I handled it," she said. He didn't threaten anything directly. He said Mrs. Alderman was concerned about the disruption my activities were causing to the community, and that it might be time for me to consider whether Red Hollow was the right place for me to be building my future." A pause. "I told him I found the community very welcoming and that I had no plans to leave." Something worked in Cole's jaw. "I told Pullman, I know what you told him. I didn't need you to fight that one." She said it without apology. "And I needed him to think he'd succeeded in making me uncertain, so I had time to get the documentation out before he decided to move more directly." Cole looked at her for a long time. "You let him think he'd rattled you," he said. "Yes." "So he'd back off long enough for you to Yes." Dix was very carefully not smiling. Cole was not smiling either, but the set of his face had changed into something that wasn't quite the controlled anger she'd seen in him before. It was something that had more respect in it than anger. "You could have told me," he said. "You would have gone back to Pullman." "Yes." "Which would have told him the documentation wasn't secure yet." She held his gaze. "I needed a week. I got it." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "All right." He ran a hand over his jaw. "We need to go to the ridge." "What?" They rode out to the northern ridge on a Thursday, Cole and Lena and Dix and two ranch hands who knew the country up there, carrying the old survey maps and enough provisions for a 2-day look. The ridge was a day's ride from the ranch house, up through the pine country where the air cooled and the ground changed from grassland to something rockier and more serious, the kind of landscape that reminded you the frontier wasn't decorative. Lena had ridden before, but not recently, and she didn't say anything about the fact that 2 days on horseback through rough terrain was not comfortable for a woman her size, because saying it would have changed nothing, and she had learned that there was a particular category of difficulty that was better acknowledged internally and moved through. Cole noticed without comment that she kept up, and that on the second morning, when her legs were clearly giving her trouble, she still mounted without assistance and did not mention it. The channel, what was left of it, was visible in the landscape once you knew what you were looking at. The original survey map showed it clearly, a natural watercourse that had run from the snowmelt collection points on the upper ridge down through a series of limestone outcroppings and into the creek system that fed the Sulphur Creek Basin. The rock slide of 1874 had dropped a significant mass of stone across the channel bed about a third of the way down from the upper collection point, diverting the water into a different course that ran east and away from the Barrett land. Standing at the site of the slide looking at the accumulated rock, Cole said, "This wasn't a natural slide." "No," said the older of the two ranch hands, a man named Cruz who had done mine work before cattle work and knew what he was looking at. "See how it's piled? Natural slides come down in a fan. This came straight across, like something directed it." "Can it be moved?" Cole said. Cruz looked at the rock mass for a long time, walking the perimeter of it, crouching to look at the underside, standing back and looking at the ridge above. "With the right equipment and enough hands," he said finally. "It's not as much as it looks. The main blockage is about 40 feet across and maybe 12 deep at the center. The rock around it," he pointed. "That's secondary accumulation, stuff that's rolled in over 50 years. The original collapse is underneath." "How long?" "If we started now with a 6-man crew and the right equipment," Cruz chewed his lip, "3 weeks, maybe 4 if the weather turns." Cole looked at Lena. She was standing a few yards away from the others, at the edge of the old channel bed, where it ran clear of the rock pile, looking at the limestone surface. She had the composition book out, making notes, and she didn't look up immediately. When she did, she said, "The summer heat peak is in 6 weeks. If the creek drops below the critical threshold for the herd before we have the channel open, you're looking at culling." She paused. "Which is what Hargrove needs to happen. If the herd is culled, the ranch value drops. That's when they make the offer." "Bet 6 weeks," Cole said. "4 if you start now," Cruz said. Cole looked at the rock pile. The sun was hitting it at an angle that made the edges of the stone sharp and actual looking, the kind of realness that plans tend to lose when they're still abstract. "We start Monday," he said. Chuck. He told no one in town. That was the first decision, and it was Lena's suggestion. Pullman had sources somewhere in the community. Tipton at the land office was the obvious one, but probably not the only one. And the channel project needed to be far enough along before it became known that stopping it would require open interference rather than quiet pressure. What this meant in practice was that Cole arranged the equipment through the Marsh operation. Harlan Marsh, whose cooperative freight arrangement was now formalized on paper, had an equipment cache from his son's demolition work that was available, and hired the crew from outside Red Hollow, men from the mining camps in the north, who came recommended by Marsh's son, and who had no connection to anyone in the county. Lena handled the logistics. She handled them with the same methodical precision she brought to the ranch ledgers, which was to say she handled them very well, building the supply schedule and the crew rotation and the equipment manifest into a single document that Cole and Dix could work from without needing to ask her where anything was. She also filed the documentation with Attorney Devereaux in the Capitol. The full package, the water right transfer history, the freight manifest for Callaway Regional Works, the Marsh Sons demolition assessment of the slide site, and the original survey maps showing the channel's pre-1874 course. Devereaux wrote back within 2 weeks. She was filing a formal inquiry with the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. The inquiry cited potential fraudulent interference with public water resources, which was a territorial offense and not subject to county jurisdiction. The letter arrived on a Saturday morning. Cole read it at the kitchen table and passed it to Lena without saying anything. She read it. She set it down. "Hargrove's going to find out about this," she said. "Yes." "How long before the inquiry becomes public record?" Devereaux says 30 to 60 days before the commissioner's office has to respond publicly. "That's inside our window," she said. "If the channel is open before Hargrove knows the inquiry is active, the legal case supports the physical reality. If he finds out first," she paused. "He'll try to stop the channel project," Cole said. "Yes." A beat. "Or he'll try to stop me." It was the first time she'd said it directly, and the saying of it changed the temperature in the room by a degree. "That's not going to happen," Cole said. She looked at him steadily. "I'm not frightened," she said, which he believed. "I'm accounting for the variable. There's a difference." "I know," he said, "and I'm accounting for it too." She picked up the letter again, reread something in the middle of it. "Devereaux is good," she said. She didn't just file the inquiry. She sent a copy directly to the territorial governor's office simultaneously. It's harder to make a document disappear when it's in 2 places. "You asked her to do that?" "I suggested it. She agreed it was the right move." He looked at her across the kitchen table on that Saturday morning, with the light coming in from the east window the way it did this time of year, and the sounds of the ranch outside and the letter from the Capitol sitting between them. He thought about November, the composition book she'd had before he'd met her, the water board meetings she'd attended alone in the back row, the dried apple slices she'd put back on the shelf. "Lena," he said. "I want to ask you something." She looked up. "When this is over," he said, "however it goes, I want you to stay." She was quiet. "Not as the bookkeeper," he said. "Not as the records person. I mean—" He stopped because he was better at stating things plainly than at approaching them from the side, and he'd been approaching this one from the side for too long. "I mean stay. Here. With me." The morning light was doing something specific to the room. Outside, one of the horses in the yard made a sound, and a hand answered it, and the ordinary life of the ranch went on with complete indifference to what was happening in the kitchen. Lena looked at the letter, then at the table surface, then at him. "You don't know how this ends," she said. "No. The channel might not open in time. Hargrove might move before Devereaux's inquiry gets traction. The herd might—" "Lena." She stopped. "I'm not asking because things are going well," he said. "I'm asking because—" He thought about how to say the next part accurately. "Because you've been in this with me since before either of us said we were in anything, and I want to be clear about what I'm asking." She looked at him for a long time with the expression she reserved for things she was assessing carefully. "Ask me again when it's over," she said finally. "Why?" "Because right now the answer would be yes," she said. "And I want to be sure it's yes because of the right reasons and not because everything is terrible and you're the best thing in the room." He almost smiled. "I'm the only thing in the room." "That's my point," she said, and there was something in her voice, not quite a smile, but the precondition of one, that made the morning feel briefly like something other than the situation they were actually in. He picked up the letter and folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "All right," he said, "when it's over." The crew started on Monday, as Cole had said they would. By Thursday, Pullman knew something was happening on the northern ridge. Cole could read it in the man's face at the grain exchange, the particular watchfulness of someone who has received incomplete information and is trying to complete it. By the following Monday, Hargrove himself appeared in Red Hollow for the first time since the previous autumn, arriving quietly and taking a room at the boarding house, which meant he was now in the same building where Lena lived. Cole moved her to the ranch house that evening, with no discussion beyond the practical. He told Mrs. Alderman that Lena was needed on-site for the ranch project, which was true, and that he would cover the room costs through the end of the month, which stopped the conversation before it could become something else. Lena brought her things in the same satchel she'd arrived with the first Monday she'd come to work at Barrett Ranch. She looked around the spare room he showed her. Simple, clean, with a window that faced east and caught the morning light, and set the satchel on the floor and said, "All right." "The lock on that door works," he said. "I know. And Dick sleeps in the next room." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Cole, I'm fine." "I know you're fine," he said. "I'm telling you the practical facts." She almost smiled again. "Good night," she said. "Good night," he said, and went down the hall to his own room and lay awake for a while listening to the ranch settle into the night sounds it made, the wood contracting in the cooling air, the horses shifting in the paddock, the distant particular silence of the northern ridge where 6 men were working in relay shifts to move a rock slide that might or might not have been put there deliberately 50 years ago. The drought was in its 7th week. The creek was at 30%. The herd was holding, but barely. Hargrove was in town. And somewhere in the territorial capital, an attorney named Devereaux was waiting for the land commissioner's office to respond to a document she'd filed in 2 places simultaneously, which was the kind of redundancy that Lena Hart understood instinctively, and that might, in the end, be the thing that mattered most. The night was dry and windless, the way drought nights are, flat and hot even after dark, without the relief that a moving sky should bring. Cole stared at the ceiling of his bedroom and thought about the channel and the rock and the 6 weeks they had and the woman down the hall who had told him to ask again when it was over. He intended to. Hargrove made his move on a Wednesday. Cole had been expecting something. He just hadn't known what form it would take, and the form it took was more direct than he'd anticipated. A county sheriff's deputy appeared at Barrett Ranch mid-morning with a notice of temporary injunction signed by Commissioner Harlow, ordering all work on the northern ridge to cease pending a review of whether the channel restoration constituted unauthorized alteration of a public waterway. Cole read the notice in the yard, standing in the heat that had settled over everything like a weight. The deputy, a young man named Greer, who had the uncomfortable expression of someone delivering a message he doesn't believe in, stood a few feet away and waited. "Who filed the injunction request?" Cole said. "The commissioner's office," Greer said, "on behalf of a complaint from Meridian Land and Cattle." Meridian filed a complaint about a waterway that their own fraudulent water rights depend on. Greer said nothing. He had the sense to say nothing. Cole folded the notice. "Tell Harlow I received it," he said, and went inside. Lena was at the desk in the small office, working through the supply ledger for the channel project, and she looked up when he came in and set the notice on the desk in front of her. She read it without touching it, as if she wanted to take in the full shape of it before she handled it. Then she picked it up and read it again. "Harlow signed it himself," she said. "Yes, that's a mistake on their part." Her voice had a quality he recognized, the concentrated calm of someone thinking faster than they're speaking. "Harlow's involvement in a county injunction that directly benefits Meridian puts him inside the conspiracy. That's not a board administrator making a procedural error. That's an official act in furtherance of fraud." "Devereaux," Cole said. "I need to write to her today. If the territorial commissioner's office has the injunction document combined with what they already have," she was already reaching for paper, "this might actually accelerate the inquiry rather than stop the project." "It still stops the project," Cole said. "The crew can't work under a county injunction." She paused, pen in hand. "How long can the herd hold?" "Dick says 10 days at the current creek level. Maybe 12 if we push the north herd to the Haverford acreage where your sheep are." She looked at the window. "My sheep are on that acreage." "I know. I'll compensate you for any grazing damage." "Cole, I don't care about the sheep." She said it sharply, then immediately softened it. "I mean, the sheep matter, but they're not." She stopped. 10 days? Maybe 12. The channel crew is how far from clearing the main blockage. Crew says they're through the secondary accumulation. The original collapse is exposed. 2 more days of work would get them to the point where a controlled blast could clear what's left. He sat down across from her. 2 days of work we can't legally do. She put the pen down, picked it up, put it down again. "What if," she said carefully, "the crew isn't working on the channel?" He looked at her. "The injunction covers unauthorized alteration of a public waterway," she said. "The channel bed itself is a public waterway, but the ridge above it, the rock slide debris field, that's on Barrett land. The original survey puts the property line above the channel bed. She was reaching for the survey map now, unfolding it on the desk beside the notice. If the crew is clearing debris from private land and that debris removal incidentally affects the channel below, that's a thin line, Cole said. Yes. She looked at the map. But it's a line. And by the time Harlow figures out the distinction and files a broader injunction, Devereaux's response from the territorial office will either be in hand or it won't matter. He studied the map. The property line was where she said it was. The legal argument was thin enough to see through, but thinness wasn't the same as inaccuracy. I need Dix to look at this, he said. Get Dix, she said. I'll write the letter to Devereaux. Dix looked at the map and the injunction for a long time, with the expression of a man calculating odds he doesn't entirely like. The property line argument, he said finally, a county judge would probably not buy it. We're not arguing it in front of a county judge, Cole said. We're using it to keep the crew working for 48 hours while the territorial inquiry gains traction. If Harlow sends the deputy back out there, then we stop and we deal with it. But right now we have a legal argument that isn't obviously wrong, and I'd rather make Harlow explain why it is wrong than assume he's right. Dix chewed on that. Crews won't like working under these conditions. Crews is being paid well. Being paid well doesn't help much if you're on the wrong end of a county enforcement action. I'll go up there and explain the situation to him personally, Cole said. He can make his own call. Dix looked at the map again, then at Cole. Then, for reasons that probably had something to do with 22 years of working for the Barrett family, he said, all right, let's go talk to Cruz. They rode out that afternoon, Cole and Dix, and Lena insisted on coming, and Cole didn't argue because he'd learned that arguing with her about things she'd already decided was a poor use of time. She rode with them through the heat, which was punishing by midday, the kind of dry heat that pulls moisture out of everything it touches. Cruz was at the ridge site with his 5-man crew when they arrived. He was a compact man who wasted very few words and assessed situations quickly, which was probably why he'd survived the mine work long enough to transition to cattle country. He listened to Cole's explanation of the property line argument, looked at the map, looked at the injunction notice, and said, "You're telling me this is legal." "I'm telling you there's a legal argument for it," Cole said. That's not the same thing. What's the risk to me and my crew if the county comes up here? You stop work immediately and cooperate fully. The argument about the injunction's scope is mine to make, not yours. Your employees following employer direction. Cruz considered this. How close are we to the main blast point? You tell me. Cruz turned and looked at the excavated rock face, which was now fully exposed, a compressed mass of limestone and granite that had come down in what, if you looked at it carefully, was a remarkably linear pattern for a natural slide. 12 hours of prep work, Cruz said. Then we blow it. 12 hours. If nothing goes wrong. Up here, something usually goes wrong. Cole looked at Lena. She was looking at the exposed rock face with an expression he couldn't read, something that was turning over privately behind her eyes. Do it, Cole said. Daylight to dark today, and tomorrow morning. Whatever you can get. They stayed at the ridge site that night. Cole had brought bedrolls and provisions, and the practical understanding that riding back to the ranch and then back up again in the morning would cost them hours they didn't have. They camped at the tree line above the work site, and the crew worked by firelight into the evening on the preparation work. The careful drilling and setting that had to be done correctly, or the blast would move rock in the wrong direction and close the channel permanently instead of opening it. It was not a comfortable night. The ground was rocky, the air stayed hot even after dark, and sometime around 2 a.m, a section of the excavated debris shifted and came down with a sound like a door slamming somewhere deep in the earth, which brought everyone upright and sent crews scrambling down to assess the damage by torchlight. The shift had closed off about 6 feet of the dig they'd done that afternoon. Cruz stood looking at it for a long time, holding his torch. Cole came down the slope to stand beside him. How bad? 4 hours of work, Cruz said. Maybe 5. It's loose material. It came down clean. We can move it again. But we've lost... Yeah. Cruz looked at the sky, which was lightening at the eastern edge in the particular pre-dawn way that looks like everything will be all right before the sun comes up and reminds you otherwise. We'll work through. My boys knew this wasn't going to be simple when they took the job. Cole went back up the slope to where Lena was sitting upright in her bedroll with the composition book on her knee, writing in the near dark by feel more than sight. "What are you writing?" he said, sitting down beside her. "Letters," she said. "One to Devereaux, one to Harlan Marsh, one to the Reedman family." The Reedmans. They sold too fast, and I think they didn't know what they were selling to. If they knew, if they understood that the buyers were the same people who engineered the water problem in the first place, they might be willing to provide a statement. That adds another voice to the territorial inquiry. She kept writing. Also, Burl Reedman has a grudge against Hargrove now because the offer he got was about 40% below what the land was worth, and a man with a grudge and the right information is occasionally useful. Cole looked at her in the near dark, writing letters, in a composition book by feel, on a rock hillside in the middle of the night during the worst drought the county had seen in 20 years. "You never stop," he said. "Working, thinking about the next thing." She paused. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "No, it's not a problem." She went back to the letter. He sat beside her and didn't sleep, and the crew worked below them in the torchlight, and the sky kept lightening in the east. And eventually the sun came over the ridge and made everything worse for about 3 hours the way summer sun in drought country does. And then it became simply the thing you worked in because there was no alternative. The deputy came back at 10:30 in the morning. It was Greer again, and he had a second document this time. A broader injunction that covered not just alteration of the public waterway, but any excavation or earth moving within 300 yards of the channel bed, which eliminated the property line argument cleanly. He'd also brought 2 other men with him, not deputies, private men, well-dressed for the terrain in a way that looked expensive and purposeful. Cole recognized one of them, Hargrove. He was older than Cole had pictured from Dix's description, mid-50s, heavy through the shoulders, with the particular stillness of a man who has been in difficult situations before and has learned that showing nothing is more effective than showing anything. He stood at the edge of the work site and looked at the excavated rock face and the crew, and something moved through his expression that might have been alarm, quickly compressed. "Mr. Barrett," Greer said, unhappy about all of it, "I have to ask the crew to stop." Cole took the new injunction and read it. "Cole," Dix's voice, low, from beside him. "Look at the channel." He looked. Below the work site, at the point where the channel bed ran clear of the debris field, there was water. Not much. A thin film of it, dark against the pale limestone of the channel bed, moving slowly, following the old course the way water follows the path. It has always known, even when that path has been blocked for 50 years. The blast hadn't happened yet, but the prep work, the drilling, the clearing of the secondary debris, the shift in the underlying rock during the night, had apparently done something to the pressure dynamics behind the main blockage, and what was coming through was small, maybe a trickle, but it was coming through. Hargrove saw it too. "Mr. Greer," he said, with a controlled urgency that wasn't quite panic but was adjacent to it, "that injunction needs to be enforced now." "The crew is stopping," Greer said. "Mr. Barrett." "The crew is stopping," Cole said. He looked at Cruz. Cruz looked at the water in the channel bed. The whole situation sat in the morning heat for a moment. "We don't need the blast," Cruz said quietly. "The structural integrity of that blockage." He was looking at the main debris face, and Cole could see it too now, a shifting in the upper section, a slow lean that hadn't been there yesterday. That rock is coming down on its own. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, but it's coming. Hargrove heard that. His jaw tightened, and he looked at the private man beside him, Pullman, who had come up from town and was standing in the heat in his freight depot clothes with an expression of progressive dismay. And something passed between them that wasn't reassuring to either of them. "There is nothing in that injunction," Cole said to Greer, carefully, "that prevents a natural rock slide from occurring." Greer looked at him, then at the debris face, then at Hargrove. "No," Greer said slowly, "I don't suppose there is." "Then I'd suggest your men step back from the base of that formation," Cole said, "for safety reasons." The main blockage came down that afternoon. Not all at once. It announced itself first with sounds, a series of deep cracks from inside the rock mass that the crew heard from the tree line where Cole had moved everyone after Greer and Hargrove's men had retreated down the slope. The cracks came at intervals over about 2 hours, each one a little larger, a little more definitive, like a structure deciding something. Lena was standing beside Cole at the tree line. She had the composition book in her hands, but she wasn't writing in it. She was watching. The final collapse happened in the late afternoon, when the sun was dropping west and the heat was marginally less murderous. The upper section of the blockage gave first, a section maybe 15 feet across that had been leaning incrementally all day. And when it went, it took the structural support from the middle section, and the middle section went, and what followed was a few minutes of noise and dust that made the horses pull at their ties and made everyone at the tree line take an involuntary step back, even though they were well clear. When the dust settled, the channel was open. Not perfectly, so there was debris in the bed that would need clearing, loose material that had come down with the collapse. But the main obstruction was gone, and the water that had been pressing against it for decades came through in a way that was initially modest, and then, as it found its course and the pressure equalized, became a genuine flow. Clean water, cold from the upper ridge, running down through the limestone channel in the direction it had always intended to go, toward the Sulphur Creek Basin and the Barrett Land and the 1,800 cattle that were 10 days away from a critical threshold. Nobody said anything for a moment. Cruz broke it. "Well," he said, "there's your channel." Lena sat down on a rock. Not dramatically. She just sat down, as if her legs had made a decision independently. She put the composition book in her lap and looked at the water moving in the channel below them. And Cole, standing beside her, saw that her hands were not quite steady. He sat down next to her. Not close enough to be inappropriate, just close enough to be present. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." A pause. "I didn't let myself believe it would work," she said. "I kept doing the work, but I didn't let myself believe it." "Why not?" "Because if I believed it and it failed—" She stopped. It was easier not to. He understood that. The discipline of not hoping too specifically for things that might not happen. He understood it from his own experience, and from watching her operate for the past 8 months. And it explained something about her that he'd noticed but not fully articulated, the way she engaged with problems intensely while keeping her investment in outcomes at a controlled distance. "It worked," he said. "Yes." She looked at the water. It worked. Below them, the crew was beginning to move down the slope to assess the channel, and Dix was talking to Cruz about the debris clearing, and the horses had settled, and the late afternoon light was doing something golden across the ridge that had nothing to do with anything except the physics of sun through dry air at a particular angle. "Cole," Lena said. The question you asked me before." She was still looking at the channel. "When this was over." He waited. "It's not over yet," she said. "Hargrove and Pullman are still—" "I know," he said. "The territorial inquiry hasn't concluded. The water rights haven't been—" "Lena." She stopped. "You can say yes, or you can say you need more time," he said. "Either one is an honest answer. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him then, directly, the way she looked at things she was assessing seriously. The late light was doing something to her face that made her look less guarded than she usually did. Or maybe she had simply decided, in the context of a rock slide that had just solved one of their largest problems, that guarding against this particular thing was more effort than it was worth. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything immediately, just nodded, and the simplicity of it seemed to be the right response because she didn't look away or qualify it. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. What happened next moved quickly, the way things accelerate once a structure starts to fall. Devereaux's response from the Territorial Commissioner's office arrived at Barrett Ranch 2 days after the channel opened, brought by a courier from the capital. The commissioner had reviewed the documentation and was initiating a formal investigation into the Meridian land and cattle water right acquisitions and their connection to Commissioner Harlow and Cass Pullman. Pending the investigation, all Meridian water right transfers in the county were frozen. They couldn't be exercised, and they couldn't be sold. Cole read the letter at the kitchen table. Lena read it after him. Dix read it after her. "Hargrove's position just got a lot worse," Dix said. "He knew it was coming," Lena said. "When he saw the channel open, he knew. That's why he left town that same evening." "He's gone?" Mrs. Alderman told me this morning. He checked out of the boarding house the day after the channel opened. Cole looked at Pullman's name in the letter, which appeared 3 times in connection with specific water board decisions. Pullman's still here. He doesn't have anywhere to go, Lena said. His freight operation is here. He can't just leave. She paused. He's probably trying to figure out how much the territorial investigators already know and whether there's a version of this where he comes out on the other side of it. There isn't, Cole said. No, she agreed. There isn't. Harlan Marsh came out to Barrett Ranch that same afternoon, driving his own wagon, which was a thing he didn't often do. He sat in the front room and accepted coffee from Dix and said, "The Reedmans want to talk to the territorial investigators. He's got a lot of anger about what Meridian paid him for that land. He called me last night." "Burl Reedman has a lot of anger about most things," Dix said. "This time it's pointed in the right direction," Marsh said. "I think he'll cooperate." He looked at Cole. "I'd like to cooperate too, formally. What I know about the freight operations that Pullman's been running through my contracts, some of it connects to the supply routes He glanced at Lena, who was at the table with her composition book. "To what you found in the manifest. I'll put you in contact with Devereaux," Lena said without looking up. "She'll want a formal statement." Marsh looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Miss Hart," he said, "I owe you an apology." She looked up. "What for?" "For the way I spoke about you. Last winter at the stock meeting." He said it plainly without dressing it up. "Things I said that you probably didn't hear but that weren't right. I'm sorry." The room was quiet. Lena held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I appreciate that." And she went back to the composition book, which was her way of indicating that the matter was acknowledged and settled because she didn't have much patience for extended ceremony, even when the ceremony was well-intentioned. Marsh looked at Cole. Cole looked at Marsh. Marsh nodded, once, and picked up his coffee. The water from the mountain channel reached the Sulphur Creek Basin on the 5th day after the collapse, a fact that Dix confirmed by riding out to the creek's measurement point at dawn and coming back with wet boots and a report that the flow had increased by 30% overnight. The herd didn't immediately improve. Cattle recovery from drought stress takes time and doesn't happen in a single morning. But the crisis threshold moved back, and 10 days became 3 weeks became, probably, enough time for the creek level to stabilize before the summer peak. It wasn't over, but the edge of the cliff had moved, Cole told the hands at breakfast. They were quiet for a moment, and then one of the younger ones, a boy named Foster who'd been with the operation less than a year, said, "Is it true Miss Hart found the old channel on the maps?" In the tone of someone who has heard this and isn't sure whether to believe it. "She found the maps," Cole said. "She found the manifest that showed the channel was closed deliberately. She put together the case that got the territorial inquiry opened." He looked at Foster. "Yeah, it's true." Foster thought about that. "Huh," he said. "Huh is right," Dick said, pouring coffee. The hands went back to breakfast. Cole sat at the head of the table and looked at the empty chair where Lena usually sat. She'd gone to the land office that morning for what she said was one final records pull, and thought about November and the scarf, and the particular shape of how a thing begins versus how it develops versus what it becomes when it's fully itself. He'd been ranching long enough to know that most things worth building take longer than you expect and cost more than you planned and look, at various points along the way, completely hopeless. He'd been applying that knowledge to cattle and land for 15 years. It occurred to him, sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in late July, with the creek rising and the herd holding and the territorial investigators due in Red Hollow the following week, that it applied to other things too. Outside the window, the south pasture grass was still dry and pale. It would take time. The grass, the herd, the creek, all of it. The drought wasn't done yet, and the legal proceedings would run their own course on their own timeline. And Red Hollow would take a while to recalibrate, as towns do, because communities are slow to acknowledge that they were wrong about something. But the channel was open. The water was moving. And Lena Hart was coming back from the land office this afternoon with whatever she'd found, composition book in hand, ready for whatever came next. Cole Barrett was, for the first time in a long time, not worried about what came next. He picked up his hat and went out to check on the horses. The territorial investigators arrived on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day in every other respect. The creek was still rising, the herd was stabilizing, and Lena was at the ranch desk working through the August supply projections with the focused quiet that Cole had come to think of as the sound of things being handled. There were two of them, sent from the capital by the land commissioner's office. A senior investigator named Aldous Crane, who was 60 and had the deliberate manner of a man who has seen most varieties of human dishonesty and stopped being surprised by them, and a younger woman named Pratt, who carried two leather document cases and said very little but wrote everything down. They set up in the Red Hollow Courthouse, the same building that housed Commissioner Harlow's office, which was either an oversight or a pointed statement, and began calling people in. Harlow was first. He came out of his initial interview 2 hours later looking like a man who has just understood, fully and finally, the geometry of the trap he is in. He did not go back to his office. He went to the Red Hollow Saloon, which opened at 10, and sat at the bar, and the bartender later reported that he didn't say a single word for 3 hours. Pullman was next. Pullman, unlike Harlow, had prepared. He had a lawyer from the capital, a man in a good coat who arrived the night before the interviews and spent the morning in conference with his client. The preparation showed in the interview's length. It ran most of the day, with breaks. What came out of it, according to what Crane told Cole afterward, was a partial cooperation, Pullman confirming the broad outlines of the Meridian arrangement in exchange for a reduced finding against his freight operation, but protecting himself by directing the investigators toward Hargrove as the scheme's architect. Hargrove himself was not in the territory. Crane said this without particular surprise, as if he'd expected it, which he probably had. There was a warrant being processed through the territorial court. Whether it would reach Hargrove wherever he'd gone was a question that lived in the category of things Cole could not control, so he filed it there and focused on what he could. Burl Reedman gave his statement on the third day. Cole wasn't present for it, but Lena had drafted the questions she thought Crane should ask. Specific, document-referenced questions about the timing of Meridian's offer relative to the water right transfers, and she'd sent them through Devereaux, who had transmitted them to Crane through proper channels. Cole had been skeptical that Crane would use questions from a private party, but when he talked to Crane afterward, the investigator said, "With the precise economy of a man who respects good work regardless of its source, whoever prepared those questions understood the documents." "She did," Cole said. Crane looked at him. "Miss Hart." It wasn't a question. Her name had appeared throughout the documentation, on every cross-reference, every annotated survey map, every freight manifest marked with her precise handwriting. "Yes," Cole said. "I'd like to speak with her formally," Crane said. "Her documentation is the backbone of this case. If this goes to territorial court, and it will, she'll likely be called as a material witness." "She knows," Cole said. "She's prepared for it." Crane nodded slowly. "How long has she been working with these records?" Cole thought about November, the composition book with its worn cover, the back row of the water board meeting where nobody had asked why she was there. "About 9 months," he said, "on her own time, before I was involved." Crane absorbed that. 9 months, he said, and wrote something in his own notes. And Cole had the sense that whatever he wrote was not purely procedural. Ta-ta. Lena's interview with Crane lasted 4 hours. Cole waited outside the courthouse for the first hour, and then Dix made him leave, which was the right call, because standing in front of a building accomplishes nothing, and Cole was bad at doing nothing. She came out at late afternoon with her composition book tucked under her arm, and the expression of someone who has been asked a great many questions and has answered all of them accurately, and is now tired in the specific way that careful honesty is tiring. Cole was at the ranch by then, back with the herd, and she rode out to find him. She could ride alone now, had been doing it since June, on a mare from the Barrett stable that had decided early on that Lena was acceptable. She found him at the north fence line where he was checking the water levels in the secondary trough, and she dismounted and stood beside him and said, "He thinks it will go to court by October." The full case. Hargrove, Harlow, Pullman, the scheme as a whole. Devereaux says the water right transfers alone constitute a territorial fraud charge, and the Callaway manifests, the dynamite delivery to the Ridge in 1874, that's potentially criminal interference with public infrastructure. She paused. They're going to try to reconstruct who authorized it. Hargrove would have been young then. He might have been working for someone else, meaning the scheme might go back further than Hargrove. Possibly. Crane didn't say that directly, but the questions he asked about the earliest land records, she shook her head. This county has been set up for a long time. Cole looked at the trough, which was fuller than it had been 2 weeks ago. The creek level was still not what it should be for August, but it was holding. The channel was doing its work. The Reedman land, he said. Crane says that's a civil matter separate from the criminal case. Burl can pursue recovery of the difference between what Meridian paid him and fair market value, but that's going to take time and the outcome isn't certain. She looked at the fence line. He'll probably get something, not everything. That's how these things usually go. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. The mare dropped her head and found something in the dry grass to investigate. Cole, Crane asked me about the scarf. He looked at her. He was asking about when I first became aware of the water rights situation, the timeline of my investigation, and I explained that I started going to the water board meetings in the fall, that I'd had a reason to be paying attention to county records, and he asked what the reason was. She glanced at him sideways with a faint expression. I told him I was trying to understand how the county worked because I had plans to lease land, and I wanted to know the system I was operating in. That's true. It is. But it left out that the actual first thing that pointed me toward the water rights was the billing error I found in the ranch ledger after you hired me, which itself happened because of... She stopped. The scarf, he said. The scarf, she said, which means the whole thing, the documentation, the channel, Devereaux, the inquiry, traces back to a Tuesday afternoon in November when I walked to Barrett Ranch with a piece of knitting. He looked at her for a long moment in the late afternoon light, which was doing what late afternoon light does in summer drought country, turning everything amber and a little melancholy, the particular beauty of a landscape that is dry and still manages to be beautiful anyway. You walked 2 miles, he said. 2.5. I'd miscounted. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that family. She looked at him, and then she laughed too. Actually laughed, the real kind that she didn't produce often. Unguarded enough that the mare looked up from the grass. It was the first time since November that both of them laughed at the same time about the same thing. And it was over quickly, but it sat in the air after it ended in a way that felt like the beginning of a habit. The formal findings from the territorial investigation were published in September. Crane's report ran to 47 pages, and the summary that circulated through Red Hollow, in the truncated, slightly distorted way that official findings always circulate through small towns, made certain things clear that had previously been matters of rumor and speculation. Cass Pullman was found to have used his position on the county water board to facilitate the transfer of water rights to entities he held an undisclosed financial interest in. He was removed from the board, barred from holding any county administrative position, and subject to a financial penalty assessed against his freight operation. The freight business itself survived. He sold off 2/3 of it to cover the penalty and continued with what remained, diminished and largely stripped of its political leverage. He was still in Red Hollow the following spring, quieter than he'd been, conducting what business he had left. Commissioner Harlow resigned before the findings were published. He left Red Hollow with his wife and 2 grown children and moved to a town 3 territories over that had no reason to know his name. Nobody in Red Hollow mentioned him much afterward. There's a particular kind of community forgetting that happens around men who turned out to be smaller than their position suggested, and Red Hollow applied it to Harlow with the efficiency of people who have other things to think about. Hargrove was located in late October, a town near the southern border, traveling under a different name, which was the kind of decision that tends to confirm what people suspected about a man's character. He was brought back to the territorial capital under warrant, and the case against him was still working through the courts when the following spring arrived. It was slow, the way courts are slow, but Devereaux wrote to Cole and Lena regularly with updates, and her assessment was consistent. The documentation was solid, it would hold. The water rights that Meridian had accumulated were frozen by the territorial court pending resolution of the fraud case, which meant they couldn't be exercised and they couldn't be transferred. The small landowners who had sold their rights were not able to recover them easily. Rights transferred under valid-appearing contracts are complicated to reclaim, but several of the most clearly fraudulent transfers were voided outright. And the overall effect on Hargrove's scheme was that it produced him nothing. All that engineering, all those years of patient maneuvering, and he ended up in a territorial courthouse with a lawyer trying to put distance between him and 47 pages of documented evidence. It was not a satisfying ending for him. Cole was comfortable with that. But the town's opinion of Lena Hart changed the way most things change in small communities. Not in a single moment, not with any formal announcement, but in the accumulation of small adjustments, each one minor, that collectively add up to something different from what came before. It started with Crane's report, which named her documentation work explicitly in the findings methodology section. A federal territorial document referring to the work of a 22-year-old woman with no professional credentials was a fact that Red Hollow had trouble fitting into the story it had been telling about her. And facts that don't fit stories tend to eventually pressure the stories into changing shape. It continued with the water situation. The mountain channel's contribution to the Sulphur Creek drainage, not just for Barrett Ranch, but for every landowner in the basin, became impossible to ignore as August turned to September, and the creek held where it should have failed. Harlan Marsh said it publicly at the September stock meeting, which was the first time Lena attended one of those meetings, and sat in the front rather than the back. He said it plainly, with the directness of a man who had already apologized privately and was now doing it at scale. The Channel Project, what Cole did, and what Lena Hart found in those records, that's why we still have water. All of us. Not just Barrett Ranch. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet, in the particular way of a community reaching a collective acknowledgement. Margaret Hollis came to Barrett Ranch on a Saturday afternoon in September. She came alone, without the social framing she'd used in February, without the careful management of her own position that had characterized most of her interactions with Cole. She asked to speak with Lena, which Cole registered with something between surprise and respect, and he showed her to the small office where Lena was working and left them alone. He didn't hear what was said. He heard the conversation last about 20 minutes, and when Margaret came out, her face had the look of a woman who has done something that cost her something and considers the cost fair. She said goodbye to Cole with a nod that meant more than goodbye, and left. He found Lena at the desk, looking at the middle distance in the way she did when she was processing something. "What did she say?" he said. "She said she was wrong about me." Lena paused. "And that she was wrong about what she thought a woman needed to bring to a situation to be worth taking seriously." Another pause. "She said it better than that. She was specific about it." "What did you say?" "I thanked her." She looked at him. "She didn't have to come." "No," he said. "She didn't." Lena looked at the desk, at the ledgers and the survey copies, and the supply schedules that were the ongoing texture of her work at Barrett Ranch. "I don't need her to have come," she said carefully. "I was fine without it, but—" She stopped. "But it matters," he said. "Yes," she said. "It matters a little. That's allowed." He thought about all the months she'd spent being careful not to need things she wasn't going to get. The controlled distance she'd kept between herself and hope. The dried apple slices she'd put back on the shelf. "Yeah," he said. "It is." They married in October, which surprised some people and surprised no one who had been paying actual attention since November. It was not a large occasion. Cole was not a man who managed large occasions comfortably, and Lena had no family to fill a room with, and both of them found the idea of a community event attached to something this personal faintly absurd. What they did was go to the county clerk's office on a Wednesday morning with Dix and Harlan Marsh as witnesses, sign the papers, and then eat an extraordinarily good meal that Lena cooked herself that evening at the ranch house. A thing she did for the same reason she did most things, because it was within her capabilities and she saw no reason to outsource it to someone else. Dix ate 3 portions and said it was the best meal he'd had in 4 years, which was his version of a wedding toast. After dinner, when Marsh had driven home and Dix had gone to his room, Cole and Lena sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the October cool that was already hinting at winter coming, and Cole went inside and came back with the scarf. The dark blue one, pine bough pattern, which had been on the shelf in his bedroom since the first week of December almost a year ago. He held it out to her. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I made that for you," she said. "I know." He put it around her shoulders. "Consider it alone." She looked down at the scarf on her shoulders, And then she looked out at the ranch yard, at the fence lines and the dark shapes of the horses in the paddock, and the sky coming down full of stars the way it does in October on the frontier when the air is clear. "I counted wrong," she said, "when I walked out here that November. 2.5 miles," he said. "I'm still a little annoyed about that." "You could have turned around." "I could have," she agreed. Neither of them said anything for a while. The horses moved in the paddock, one of them blowing air through its nose, the soft sound of an animal settling. "Lena," he said. The 40 acres, the Haverford lease." "The sheep are fine," she said. "The grazing damage from the herd in July was minimal. I'm going to add 10 head in spring." "That's not—" He stopped. "I wasn't asking about the sheep." She waited. "I want to deed you the 40 acres, he said. "Properly. In your name, not leased." She was quiet. "You've been building something on that land since before any of this," he said. "That's yours. It shouldn't be contingent on a lease arrangement." "We're married," she said. "The legal question of— I know what the law says. I'm not talking about the law. I'm talking about what's yours." He looked at her. "You built that from nothing, with the wool your mother left and the money you saved working at the boarding house. That doesn't become mine because we signed a paper at the clerk's office." She looked at him for a long time. "All right," she said, in the voice she used when she was accepting something she hadn't known she needed. The following spring came better than the one before. Not dramatically better. The frontier doesn't do dramatic improvement, it does incremental, grudging recovery. But the creek ran full from April, the mountain channel holding its contribution to the basin drainage, and the herd came out of winter in better condition than it had gone in. The grass in the south pasture came up the deep green it was supposed to be, the color Dick said he hadn't seen for 3 years. Lena expanded the sheep operation to 30 head in March, which was more aggressive than the original 20 she'd planned, and she hired a young woman from one of the struggling families on the eastern edge of the county to help manage them. A girl of about 16 named Clara, who had the same watchful, capable quality that Lena recognized without needing to explain why she recognized it. She paid her properly, and she taught her the record-keeping system that she'd developed for the ranch, and Clara picked it up quickly and said very little and did the work. Lena also began formally consulting on water rights documentation for 3 smaller operations in the county. She had no official credentials for this. What she had was the Crane report naming her work and the results of the past year, which in Red Hollow constituted a credential that no institution had issued but no one questioned. She charged for the work, modestly, but not so modestly as to suggest she thought it was worth less than it was. And she kept everything documented, because documentation was how she knew where she stood in any given situation. Cole watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man who is watching something he believed in become demonstrably true. He was not the kind of man who said, "I told you so," but he thought it occasionally, and the thought was not unpleasant. Red Hollow changed that year slowly, in the way that towns changed, so it's not because anyone decided to change it, but because enough of the facts on the ground shifted that the stories people told about themselves and each other had to shift with them. The Meridian scheme had injured people beyond Barrett Ranch, and the community's shared experience of having been maneuvered by outside interests toward a crisis they barely survived had a unifying quality that the ordinary friction of frontier life rarely produces. People who had competed and resented each other found, in the cooperative freight arrangement that Cole and Harlan Marsh formalized in November, an economic structure that worked better for most of them than the old one had. The channel ran all summer. In October, a year after they'd married, Cole and Lena were at the county stock meeting, both of them in the front row, which had become ordinary by then, when the new county commissioner, a practical woman from the northern part of the county who had run on a platform of water infrastructure and won by a significant margin, announced a public infrastructure project to properly restore and maintain the mountain channel as a permanent public water source for the Sulphur Creek Basin. The documentation supporting the project, she noted, had been prepared by Lena Hart Barrett of Barrett Ranch, and was, in the commissioner's assessment, the most thorough land and water rights analysis she had seen in her 20 years working in county governance. The room clapped. Not the performative social obligation clapping of a crowd going through emotion, real clapping, the kind that happens when people have been through something together and are acknowledging it. Lena sat in the front row and did not cry because she was not particularly a crier and also because she had not done the work to be acknowledged at a stock meeting. She had done the work because it needed doing, and the acknowledgement was a side effect rather than a purpose, and she understood the difference. But she put her hand on Cole's arm briefly, and he covered it with his, and that was enough. Dix retired the following spring, not entirely, because Dix without work was a philosophical impossibility, but from the full responsibilities of foreman, handing the day-to-day operation to a younger man named Aldridge, whom Lena had identified from the ranch hands as having the right combination of competence and temperament for the role. Dick stayed on in a consultative capacity, which in practice meant he told Aldridge what he was doing wrong with the cadence of a man who has earned the right to do so. He said to Cole one evening on the porch, in a rare moment when neither of them had anything in particular that needed to be said, "You were right about her." "I know," Cole said. "I'm saying I was wrong." "I know that too." Dix was quiet for a moment. The ranch made its evening sounds around them. The hands finishing up, horses in the paddock, the particular dry grass smell of the land settling into the cooler air. "She's not what I thought," Dick said. "When she first came here, I thought, He shook his head. "I thought I knew what I was looking at. A poor girl with a good heart who was going to be a problem for you." "She was a problem for me," Cole said. "Not the kind I meant." "No," Cole agreed. "Not that kind." Dix looked at his hands. "The scarf," he said. "Of all the things. She walked out here with a scarf she made, and everything followed from that." "She walked 2.5 miles, Cole said. She miscounted." Dix considered this. She miscounted. She was annoyed about it. Dick shook his head slowly, the way an old man shakes his head at things that turn out to be more complicated than they first appeared. "Well," he said, "good thing she didn't count right." Cole looked out at the ranch, 4,000 acres of grassland running north from the Sulphur Creek Basin, the cattle in the south pasture dark shapes in the evening light, the fence lines running straight and far, the mountain ridge barely visible in the distance where a channel of water was doing exactly what water does when you give it back the course. It was always supposed to follow. There was nothing particularly romantic about what it had taken to get here. There had been a drought and a fraud scheme and a rock slide and an injunction and months of paperwork and one very cold November morning when a 22-year-old woman with worn-out boots had miscounted a distance by 1/2 mile and kept walking anyway. The towns that outlast everything else are not the ones built on the best land or the most favorable circumstances. They are the ones built by the people who stayed when staying was difficult and who trusted, when trust was not easy, that the thing they were building was worth the cost of building it. Cole Barrett knew this the way he knew most things that mattered, not from something he'd read, but from something he'd lived through, with his hands and his poor judgment and his stubborn refusal to settle for a transaction when something else was possible. Lena came out onto the porch then, with 2 cups of coffee, and handed one to Cole and one to Dix, and looked out at the ranch in the evening light the same way they'd been looking at it, with the expression of someone who does not take for granted the fact of being where she is. She had the scarf around her shoulders. She'd been wearing it since October. She'd told him it was because the evenings were getting cold. He'd told her he hadn't asked. She'd told him she was aware of that. It was dark blue wool with a pine bough pattern, and she'd made it herself. And she'd walked 2.5 miles in November boots to give it to a stranger because she wanted him to know someone had noticed what he'd done. That was all it had been. A girl with a scarf and a composition book, and the particular quality of person who does the work whether or not anyone is watching, who keeps going past the distance she'd planned because the thing at the end of it seemed worth arriving at. The frontier had a name for women like that eventually. It took a while for the name to catch up to the person. But in Red Hollow, in the years that followed, when people talked about the channel and the drought and what had almost happened and what hadn't, Lena Hart Barrett was the name that came first. Not because anyone decided to remember her that way, because some things, when you do them right and for the right reasons, remember themselves. The evening settled over the ranch. The coffee was hot. The cattle moved in the south pasture, slow and purposeful, the way cattle are when they have enough water and enough grass and the season is turning towards something they don't need to be afraid of. It was enough. More than enough. It was the thing itself.